This is Reimagining World Order, a feature podcast of the Reimagining World Order research community at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies at Princeton University. I'm Tolya Levshin, a postdoctoral fellow with the community. This podcast is jointly hosted by John Ikenberry, our research director, Chika Tonooka, a fellow postdoc, and me. On this podcast, we engage eminent scholars of world order in probing conversations about their intellectual journeys, research, and takes on our present discontents. Whether you're a professional student of international relations or a casual spectator of world affairs, our podcast aims to provide you with thought-provoking perspectives on world order from some of the world's leading minds. This is our second episode, and our guest today is Barry Buzan. Barry Buzan is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Honorary Professor at the University of Copenhagen. He is the author and co-author of more than 15 books on world order, including People, States and Fear, The Logic of Anarchy, Security, a New Framework for Analysis, Regions and Powers, The Global Transformation, and most recently, The Making of Global International Relations. Professor Buzan is famous for his work with the English School of International Relations and the Copenhagen School of Critical Security Studies, as well as his many contributions to the study of historical sociology of international systems. And now, let's turn it over to John. Take it away.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Professor Barry Buzan, for joining us today. We look forward to this discussion. You have had enjoyed a long and productive career making contributions across many parts of the field of international relations. We wanted to start by asking about your intellectual origins. Can you say a little bit about what first sparked your interest in international relations and your early intellectual influences? Presumably as you moved from the University of British Columbia to LSE to do your graduate work, what books, what debates, what moments of inspiration were there when you began to focus on security and the big topics of international relations?
Okay, it's a more primitive story than that, I fear. It probably has its roots in a rather boyish interest in war, and particularly matters naval. So once I graduated from reading about animal stories when I was 8 or 9 or something like that, I started to read about ships and the Navy and the battles of World War I and World War II. And for a time, I was quite interested in making a military career, believe it or not, for which I would have been totally ill-suited. But that boyish interest, in one sense, is what transmuted into my interest in international relations, because I learned quite a lot of history along the way and got interested in questions of war and peace and all of that. And that stayed with me. Mm-hmm. I think I can still claim to be perhaps the only person on the planet who has stood on the decks of the 2 surviving ships from the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. Second influence was that in high school, I had the good luck to be banished from the social studies class for misbehavior, and I was banished to the library, which was, of course, a kind of heaven for me. So I was very happy to be punished in this way. And in the library, I found the Outline of History by H.G. Wells, which I read. I knew of H.G. Wells because I knew of his science fiction stories. And that kind of gave me a lifelong engagement with and fascination with one-volume histories of everything, and got me kind of thinking big about history. And it was such a contrast with the history that was being taught in school. in the social studies class from which I had been thrown out, it stayed with me. And then I guess the third influence would have been when as you say, when I got to UBC, I was fortunate enough to encounter Cal Holste and Mark Zacher. And Cal was doing the kind of war studies side of things, and Mark was doing more the kind of peace international organizations side. But I was very inspired by Cal Holste's teaching. I had the good fortune to find him in 1967, just when he had finished his textbook. So what he was teaching was absolutely crystal clear. And it's there that I picked up the interest in Waltz and neorealism. I remember very well that lecture when he explained that approach to things, and it just blew me away.
That's great. And then on to the LSE. What were your experiences at that point?
Not a lot, really. I mean, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a kind of comparative study of peace movements and why they didn't work. So it was still very much in the vein of security studies. My supervisor was Adam Roberts at the time, but I didn't learn a lot from him. I'm not sure he learned a lot from me. I believe I was his first PhD student. And he just kind of left me to get on with it, basically, which is what I did. Turned out to be a not particularly good study of the British peace movement between the wars, because I couldn't find anything that had been written on that. So I had to do the primary research myself. But that didn't set my direction in any way or provide me with any particular inspiration.
Tolya, do you want to?
Yes. Well, the influence of Kenneth Waltz on your scholarship, it's palpable, and we'll return to that in a moment. But first, I want to ask you, Professor Buzan, about your creative process. For those of our listeners who are not familiar with your scholarship, we should begin by saying that you really are an extraordinarily prolific scholar, and many of your books are widely considered crucial, if not pivotal, contributions to the study of international relations. Some of my personal favorites include People, States, and Fear, Security, A New Framework for Analysis, The Logic of Anarchy, Neorealism to Structural Realism, International Systems in World History, Remaking the Study of International Relations, and of course the Global Transformation, History, Modernity, and the Making of International Relations. Each one of these books, to say nothing of the rest of your opus, develops original and illuminating ideas, many of which provoke new debates, and so help to move our discipline forward. So I would like to ask you, what is your creative process? How do you find new ideas for research? And how do you go about transforming those initial glimpses of insight into articles and books?
Well, that's a very big question, to which, again, I might have a rather dull answer. The initial kind of spark, if you will, was provided by that lecture I mentioned from Cal Holste, which introduced polarity theory. And that got me thinking in a way very different from the sort of historical way I'd been thinking up until then. And I just followed my curiosity. And the advice I've always given to students when I was teaching was follow your curiosity. It's when you're at university, probably the only chance in life you will get to do what you're interested in. And damn the consequences, as it were. But, follow your curiosity, follow your interest, and see if you can make it earn a living for you. So I've always done that. And in that sense, there was no particular kind of strategic direction or technique or anything like that. I've just wandered along where my interest took me. And that process has been very much affected by collaborating with others. I think I can probably claim some sort of record in international relations for the number of people with whom I have co-authored, which is getting up into the 30s by now. And I have found that a tremendously fruitful and stimulating process. Collaborating with Richard Little and Ole Wever and George Lawson and others, each one of those collaborations has taught me a whole bunch of new things and steered my curiosity in new and different ways. So I have found that tremendously fruitful. But again, something of a random walk. I won't say a drunkard's walk, but a random walk at least. And that walk led me to various junctures. So it led me in the late 90s and early noughties to the English school, which I really knew nothing at all about before that, or much before that. I only kind of really got to know anything at all about the English school in the early 90s. Was never taught it, didn't even know the label. But by the time I had got to that point, and with the various collaborations that I was doing, the English school seemed the obvious place that I should be. And it clearly was in need of some restoration and some additional work to bring it up to speed for the sorts of things I wanted to do. So that was a very happy encounter, and I'm still in the middle of that one.
Well, let's we'll walk through those encounters in detail in the course of this interview, and I want to begin by talking about The Logic of Anarchy. It's a book that you co-authored with Charles Jones and Richard Little. It engages directly with Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz, of course, the author of the seminal Men, State and War, as well as Theory of International Politics. And his argument in those books is that much of the competitive behavior that we observe in the international system, it can be explained in terms of the system's anarchic structure. In the absence of a world government, each state is free to pursue its interests as it sees fit. And then Waltz says to us, add to this the conjecture that all states are functionally alike, and we get the famous conclusion that observed patterns of conflict and cooperation among states can be explained in terms of the distribution of capabilities, primarily but not exclusively capabilities for military action across states. And that is the logic of anarchy, according to Waltz. You took issue with that conclusion, arguing that anarchy as such is an indeterminate influence. It does not produce particular patterns of conflict and cooperation, as Waltz wishes to claim. Tell us, if you would, where Waltz goes astray, and why you argue in the book that despite its shortcomings, his theory nonetheless offers a valuable point of departure for a more nuanced understanding of international relations.
Well, yes, I wasn't the only person to come to that kind of conclusion around that time. Wendt and others were also reaching the same sort of conclusions about the diverse logics of anarchy. I mean, for me, I think the Waltzian challenge was simply that, as I explained earlier, I was kind of more or less completely seduced by the grand simplification of polarity theory, because I had been taking a more or less historical approach to building my knowledge about international relations. And the idea that even that you might be able to encompass all of that in some kind of huge simplification like polarity theory was seriously wonderful to me. So I and many others was seduced by that and drawn into it, and I tried to make it work. And like others, I found that, seductive as it was, it just didn't work. It told you, or it appeared to tell you a bunch of things that when you looked more into them, turned out really not to be sustainable. And the actual things it told you were really perhaps rather small. Mm-hmm. And that's what motivated the project to kind of really dig into Waltz and try and unpack it and see what was wrong with this grand simplification. So it was a terrific challenge, and I remain eternally grateful to Ken for posing that challenge to me and to everybody else. It doesn't matter that I end up being critical of it. The process of thinking it challenged was tremendous, and developed my own views a lot. I think Waltz confused system and structure, and that led to a lot of looseness in the construction of his theorizing. He more or less completely left out interaction capacity, which to my mind was something that affects the way systems works a lot. And that was what pushed the way on to international systems in world history with Richard Little. Yeah. He, of course, leaves out international society altogether. And I was becoming more conscious of the fact that was actually a rather important element in what was going on. It seemed to me also that there's a fatal ambiguity in polarity theory, which it still surprises me that it has not sunk polarity theory, out of sight by now, but it still has a lot of supporters. If you look at the formulation of polarity theory, it absolutely requires a single distinction between great powers and all others. If you look at the actual discussion of international relations, there's always a distinction between superpowers and great powers and regional powers and others. And that set of distinctions is not sustainable within polarity theory. If you put them in, polarity theory becomes very complicated and falls apart. Its whole point of its grand simplification disappears. So to my mind, that alone would sink it, although it doesn't seem to diminish the enthusiasm that it still attracts. And I also became more conscious, I think, over time, as I matured, if I can be said to have matured, but I became more conscious that realism as a whole, and particularly neorealism, ran the very serious danger of being a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you believed that this theory was true, then your behavior would make it true. Mm-hmm. And that, it seemed to me, was reason by itself, as it were, to drift in another direction.
Let's talk a little bit more about that missing variable of interaction capacity, which plays a central role in much of your scholarship. Prior to the publication of The Logic of Anarchy, similar ideas, similar critiques of Waltz, as you said, were developed by other scholars. And two of them in particular focused on something very much like interaction capacity. We have first John Ruggie, who drew very heavily on Emil Durkheim to theorize interaction density as a crucial missing variable in Waltz. And then, of course, we have Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, who laid the groundwork for much of the subsequent informational institutionalist or strategic institutionalist scholarship with their idea of complex interdependence. Could I please ask you to compare and contrast your approach with theirs? In other words, in what ways does the structural theory that you develop in The Logic of Anarchy move beyond those earlier criticisms of Waltz?
Okay, I wasn't trying particularly to engage with either of those. I mean, I knew John Ruggie very well, and I knew his work very well, and I had no problem with his critique of Waltz. I thought his principal critique of Waltz was the way in which Waltz simply shut down the second tier, the differentiation of units tier. And I thought John's critique of that was fine. And I kind of took it on board, but I didn't try to challenge it or develop it in any way. The Cohen and Nye stuff didn't appeal to me all that much. I mean, I read it, of course, as everybody did, but for my taste, it was very much too focused on what I would call secondary institutions, i.e. intergovernmental organizations and regimes and rational choice and all of that. Mm-hmm. And it also had a very American focus, which didn't appeal to me very much. I wasn't operating inside America, and I wasn't kind of trying to play to an American audience at all. So my developing interest at that time was in what I would call primary institutions, the kind of underlying deep normative structures of international society that the English school was on about. And interaction capacity came into all of this because it simply seemed to be a physical variable that determined what systems meant and what they might therefore do or not do, that simply wasn't being talked about in any of these theories. So interaction capacity marched me and some others off in a quite different direction from any of this.
Let's go a little bit further in that direction. I want to ask you about how those ideas developed in International Systems in World History, which you co-authored with Richard Little. That really is a fascinating book, and for me personally, it highlights one of the most intriguing aspects of your scholarship, is your research in comparative historical sociology of international systems. You take that earlier premise of the Logic of Anarchy, about interaction density conditioning, different possibilities for world politics, and you flesh it out empirically. The historical portion of the book takes readers on an absolutely fascinating journey. You begin with the first tribal communities coalescing in the self-governing cities in Schumer, and you conclude with reflections on the fortunes of the modern state system, asking the question whether there is a postmodern state system now. The book systematizes many of your earlier contributions by developing a comprehensive framework for thinking about the evolution of world politics through the ages. Now, for a field in which much of the produced research suffers from the problems of presentism and ahistoricism, international systems in world history is a doubly helpful contribution. I wonder if I can ask you to defend the value of such a comprehensive approach to the study of world politics. And I understand that this is a question that makes more sense in an American IR context than it would in an English school context, for example. To make the question, to put it in more positive terms, could you perhaps articulate for us some of the more interesting or challenging empirical or theoretical problems that would emerge only from such a broad historical survey, and which a presentist or ahistorical approach must overlook?
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned the US in that way. I mean, this book the Chinese translation has sold as many copies as all of the English language copies put together. So there is clearly a cultural variable here in which countries are interested in this kind of approach and which are not. I mean, I think one of the difficulties with this kind of book, because this was written as a textbook. I mean,
yes.
Let me put it this way: it was commissioned as a textbook. And Richard and I tried very hard to write it as a textbook, but basically it got away from us. And it was never, I mean, in some places it's been successful as a textbook, but it really wasn't a textbook. And the problem, that's a problem still to be addressed in some ways, is that, in relatively few places where one might study IR, is it part of the curriculum to give people a decent sense of global history. It's just not in the programs. And if you look at most of the kind of international history textbooks that get used in IR teaching, they cover the last 2 centuries, if you're lucky. Some of them don't even do that. So there is still a problem there, that the kind of knowledge you need to do this doesn't come as part of the standard equipment that people are trained for in the field. I think the key to this book is, and this anticipates, I think, some of the questions to come, but the key to this book is that you can't really think about global international relations unless you've got a world or global historical perspective. Right? And that means not just knowing a decent amount about the other major civilizations in play, but also about the system as a whole, or the global society as a whole, if you prefer those kinds of terms. So it's partly about comparative, looking at the way in which different civilizations have, as it were, conducted their versions of international relations. And it's partly looking at the bigger picture. And a lot of my current work is in a sense aimed at trying to do both of these things. So Amitav Acharya and I have just finished a book along the theme of what if international relations had been invented somewhere other than in the West, in China or in India or in the Islamic world? What kind of historical resources and what kind of philosophical resources would have gone into it if conjecturally, if it had been developed in those ways? So this is a way of doing, in a sense, comparative work across cultures and civilizations. I've also got some more systemic level work going on. I'm trying to write, back to H.G. Wells again, I'm trying to write another one-volume world history, this one done in an English school perspective and looking at basically looking at world history through the lens of primary institutions, at a long view of structure and structural change. I think this provides you with some very interesting lenses on both what's different in the different civilizational histories around the world and also what's the same. I mean, a surprising number of things are the same, and we can perhaps talk about that in relation to some of the later questions.
Oh, absolutely. Just as a brief follow-up to that, when can we expect that book to come out?
Which one?
The one that you're currently working on, a comparative study of international systems.
Well, the one with Amitabh is under consideration. It's done. So with a bit of luck, it might be out in a year or so. The other one I am working on. I've written about 70 or 80,000 words of it, but there's quite a long way to go. So that's my background project. It doesn't have a particular finish date. It'll be done when I'm done or when I'm dead, one or the other, whichever comes first.
It sounds like a project of Toynbee and Sweep.
I hope so, but done in a different way. In a sense, it's not a history of who did what to who, which is what the form that most of these books take. It's a structural history, looking at the continuities and the changes and how those are patterned.
Mm-hmm. Well, the field is sorely in need of a textbook like that and a book like that. So we're very much looking forward to that. I want to ask you a slightly different question about international systems and world history, to approach it not from a research perspective, but from a pedagogical perspective. As you mentioned, the book was commissioned as a textbook, You also note in the introduction that the subtitle of the book, Remaking the Study of International Relations, it's meant quite literally. I want to ask you, what is the pedagogical purpose of introducing students, and in particular undergraduate students, to comparative historical sociology of international systems? We talked about the relevance of comparative historical sociology of international systems in the context of research and understanding these broad historical processes. But what is the pedagogical value for undergraduate students? Is it primarily additive, in the sense that, we should like to preserve the curricula that we have, but it would be good to augment them with these courses on global history? Or is it rather that you have a more reformative project in mind, where the idea is to recenter the teaching of international relations around this larger, more comprehensive study of global history? And if it is ultimately the latter, what kinds of courses and content would you like to see developed in the field? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, could you please share with us a little bit of your vision for the teaching of international relations?
Okay, it's been quite a long time since I did any teaching in international relations, so I might be getting out of date here. But the intent of the book, and I suppose the intent of the global IR project that Amitabh is leading and which I'm associated with, and these other things that I'm doing, it's certainly not just additive, right? Its intention is a good deal more subversive than that, right? So additivity might be a way of sneaking it into various kinds of curricula, but I think once it's there, it should actually subvert the discipline in the sense that, and I'm going to oversimplify here, but it's not too great a stretch to think of international relations theory, mainstream theory as it currently exists, as simply an abstraction of Western history and Western political theory, dressing it up as if it's the world or global theory. So that, in a sense, is the target of all of this work. That it's a perfectly natural thing that the discipline of international relations grew up that way, because that's the way the world was structured at the time international relations was being formed in the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. It was a Western world. It was a Western colonial world by and large. So it would have been strange to the point of impossible if the discipline had grown up in any other way, given that that's the context it was in. But it's more than past time to get away from this. But of course, it's very deeply institutionalized, not just in the teaching structures and courses, but actually in the way people understand things in their heads. Mm-hmm. That is, in some sense, what the current campaign against Eurocentrism is the kind of catchword for it all is about. And although I'm not always sympathetic to the forms in which that campaign comes, I am sympathetic to the basic substantive point that it makes, which is that we need to have an international relations discipline that is based on the world and not just an assumption that the West represents the world, which was not too bad an assumption for the first 100 years of international relations, but is already, as we sit here, becoming less and less valid as we go on. So this is a change we need to make, and the sooner we make it, the better. But it's not going to be easy. I mean, if you want to know what kind of courses I would teach, I mean, I would be teaching English school courses set up as a kind of grand theory of global history.
Professor Buzan, could you elaborate on that idea? So, what kind of courses specifically would you like to see organized?
Courses using my books, of course. Well, as I say, I mean, different people would do this in different ways. Even though Amitav and I work quite closely together, I'm sure he would be teaching this, or indeed he is teaching this, in quite a different way from what I would do, because my particular take on this, as I say, would be to set the English school up as a kind of grand theory in which you get to combine theoretical concepts and lenses with a large historical view. So I would be looking at this through the lenses of what the English school called international and world society, although I don't think I would continue to use those labels. So the project I mentioned to you, the one-volume book, possibly titled The Making of Global Society, would be looking to some extent to break down the English school distinction between international society, a society of states, and world society, which was the kind of catch-all for everything else, and try to look at the way that these kind of social structures work, not just in the interstate domain, which is where the English school has tended to put them, but right across the board. So if you look at, say, a primary institution like nationalism, say, this is something that is not just located at the interstate level. There's also something that's located in what I would call the interhuman domain. It has to do with people's identities and the broader patterns of those identities. And a lot of the other of the institutions of international society work like that. They're not just in the interstate domain, but they are actually embedded in and penetrating in, and sometimes indeed rooted in both the interhuman and the transnational domains. So I would be trying to teach global history with that kind of theoretical framing.
Thank you.
Chika, do you want to?
Yes. Professor Buzan, I wonder if I could ask you to say a little bit more about this project of global IR, because it's clearly an ambitious and critical project and something that I personally find fascinating. So clearly it's a challenge to Eurocentrism, as you say, and it's more specifically a challenge to a normative Eurocentric universalism, which you say is a false universalism, to borrow a phrase from your book with Amitav Acharya. Where do you think the integration of non-Western perspectives and experiences into IR will ultimately take us? So will IR become an account of the irreducible diversity of our histories and perspectives across time and space, at least until we get to the advent of modern Western hegemony? Or in your engagement with non-Western IR, do you see any significant commonalities of experience or assumptions across Western and non-Western IR in such a way that might make it newly possible to speak of a non-Eurocentric universality as underlying the human condition and its world political challenges?
Yeah, I think it would do both. And because it would do both, it would change the internal dynamics and identities of the discipline. I mean, to some extent, you're right. If you start taking on board other histories and other political theories and such like, you get diversity. But one of the things that Amitav and I discovered in this book on what IR might look like if it had been invented somewhere other than the West was that, in fact, you can find quite a bit of commonality, so that most of the civilizations we look at, most of them have a tradition which is recognizable as realism, and you can it's sometimes differently presented, but the realist pattern of thinking, as it were, is not unique to the West. So one can find commonalities within the differences. You will, of course, find some differences. The Chinese, for example, have a quite different way of thinking about quite a lot of things. And there are no analogs for that in the West. So if you look at the work of Qin, for example, on relationalism, I mean, he unfolds the Chinese way of thinking, if you want to put it like that, which opens up quite interesting and different dimensions about the whole logics of international relations. So it's potentially quite deeply different and would add to the diversity of theorizing in IR. But you also find a lot of commonalities. One of the things that struck me in the work I've been doing for my own history on the making of global societies is, I mean, if you look, for example, at the pre-modern period, from the dawn of civilization up to the end of the 18th century, I don't give much credence to 1648 as the peculiar IR start date for modernity. But if you look at that long period of many, many thousands of years, there are some remarkable similarities across the cultures. I mean, the general political form in all of them was empire, and the form of governance was dynasticism. And these political dynamics were all very closely linked to patterns of trade. You can find, if you look at it in that very broad structural way, you can find remarkable similarities, even when looking at history on a very large scale.
And in terms of the progress that you think has been made with this development of global IR as a field and transforming international relations, do you see any obstacles that still remain to realizing this vision? How far have we got so far?
Well, compared to where we were, say, 100 years ago, we've come an extremely long way. I mean, we have more or less, for example, abandoned race theory as one of the principal ways of thinking about international relations. So that seems to be progress of a fairly noticeable kind. I think there's still a long way to go, in the sense that I'm partly because I spent a lot of time in China over the last 20 years. It makes you very conscious of the extent to which, as it were, the rest of the world remembers the colonial era very strongly and very negatively, whereas the West, and in their own odd way, the Japanese, have been doing their best to forget about it. Right? So they remember a little bit of the golden glory days, and maybe feel a little bit guilty about slave trade and one or two other things. But by and large, the attitude of the Western world is, let's move on. This stuff, was a long time ago and shouldn't matter anymore. And that's just not the case. You see the way that the Chinese, for example, and they're far from the only ones. They're just better organized than the rest, but they bang on about the century of humiliation, and they make it central to both their academic thinking about international relations and also the way they practice international relations. And there needs to be a coming to terms with this, decentering, if you like. And this is going to be singularly difficult for the West to do. It has to go back and remember a lot of things that it's forgotten, and to think quite hard about them, and to acknowledge them, and to make some kind of reconciliation about this, because otherwise this historical burden is going to drag on and on. So this Eurocentrism, as you called it, it's more than just an academic concern. It's a very big practical policy concern as well. And in that sense, there's a long way to go. You can perhaps, I'll step onto some controversial ground here. You can perhaps measure it by the degree to which post-colonialism is still very much on the margins of mainstream IR. That said, I think the post-colonialists themselves carry a certain amount of blame for self-marginalizing, but nonetheless, that their agenda isn't a more central concern to mainstream IR seems to me to be a measure of what there still remains to do.
Mm. Can I just jump in and ask Barry a little bit more about the decentering? I hear very clearly the decentering in terms of what is to be studied, the kind of historical time and space that moves away from the West and forces us to look beyond the traditional 1648 and the Western experience as the framing for the study of international relations. Substantively, you've made that case very clear. Conceptually, I don't quite see where you're pushing Western concepts to move away from their existing configuration. It seems like you are still talking about empires, states, power, interaction, forces of production, societies. Are you trying to discomfort our theoretical categories, our concepts, as well as our historical materials for the study of international relations? And if so, what would be the most basic post-Western ideas or words and concepts that you think are necessary so as to allow us to comprehend the totality of what really is the field of international relations?
I'm going to pass on that question, John. That would require me to have seen far more deeply into the future than I either can or I'm likely to live to get to. I think what I can see pretty clearly is, as you say, more on subverting the way in which history is currently seen and used. That, I think, will have its own theoretical consequences. It may be that quite a lot of the theoretical toolkit that we now work with still remains relevant and valid in some ways, although possibly in different proportions. I'm very struck, for example, thinking about the kind of pre-modern period, so from the dawn of civilization to the 18th century. I'm very struck by the relatively large weight of what I would think of as the transnational domain in that era as compared with the political one. I mean, the history tends to be told in terms of empires and warlords and all of that. Mm-hmm. But when you kind of look at the big things that are going on, I mean, religions and trading systems, which are mostly located not in the interstate domain particularly, but transnationally and in what I call the interhuman domain, play a much bigger role. And it's conceivable we could be heading back in that sort of direction. So it might question the state centrism of IR in the longer run. But I mean, I really don't know. That's for the generations in front of me to work out.
And perhaps a key concept then that connects a lot of these issues we've been talking about in terms of decentering and how we got to where we are, where we might go next, is perhaps this concept of modernity, which you explored in detail in The Global Transformation, co-authored with George Lawson in 2015. And so I'd like to now turn to that work. A central claim of that book is that global modernity arose in the 19th century through a configuration of three key dynamics: industrialization, rational state building, and ideologies of progress. Could you take us behind the scenes and tell us how you and George Lawson arrived at those three components and your overall notion of a global transformation? So I'm wondering, were they easy decisions to come to, or were there other dynamics or conceptions that made it onto the shortlist that you later rejected?
Okay, another perhaps rather boring answer. Were they easy decisions? Yes. Were there other dynamics and conceptions that made it onto the shortlist? No. George and I started from a common dismay and frustration with the relative neglect of the 19th century in IR thinking. This seemed in many ways to be a consequence of the obsession of realism in particular, but with IR in general, with war as a way of benchmarking things. Not to mention this, which we already covered a little bit, the ridiculous pegging of modernity to 1648 in Europe. No other discipline pays any attention to 1648 as a foundational date for modernity, except IR, and for very good reason. So we both had the view from our own historical work and understanding that there was something fairly enormous missing from international relations, which had led to this relative neglect of the 19th century. So it gets mentioned along the way, oh yeah, Industrial Revolution happened then, blah, 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 and then kind of moves on. So, the benchmark dates jump from 1648 to 1914, with an occasional stop for the Napoleonic Wars. But enormous changes took place in the 19th century. From an English school perspective, there were huge changes like nationalism and the market in the institutional structure of international society. Big changes in the meaning of sovereignty, indeed. And all of that just kind of didn't really register in mainstream IR thinking. Not even much in IPE thinking, which is more surprising. So we were very frustrated by that, and our aim was to turn the magnifying glass on that and show just how transformational it was, and that The transformation had not very much to do with wars, but with much deeper and more substantive material and social revolutions. Indeed, that all happened during that time. We were acutely conscious in writing the book, and if there was a tension, maybe this was it, that we would be asked about the causes of modernity. And both of us agreed after some discussion that we would not address that question. Right? It's an enormous question. Many people cleverer than either of us have tried to address it. It still remains hugely controversial. And we didn't think we would have a lot to add to that. What we thought we could do was to present a relatively uncontroversial understanding of what happened in the 19th century. In other words, what we understood modernity to be when it happened, and then to look at its consequences downstream for both international relations, the practice, and international relations, the discipline. So that's essentially the behind-the-scenes story.
Professor Buzan, I wonder if I can ask you a follow-up here about your conception of modernity. There's a certain sense in which some people see modernity perhaps naively as a force for stability, international stability, as well as moral progress. You have these technocratic views. You have people who Daniel Dudney, for example, in his work calls Prometheans, people who believe that technological progress, the harnessing of nature for man's purposes in and of itself advances normative causes. And there are other people who believe that indeed modernity has only unleashed greater calamities and greater chaos onto humanity. What is your own conception of modernity? Is it this kind of more pessimistic conception? Is it a more optimistic conception, or is it a sort of a conception that is in between? Raymond Aron, in his lectures on War and Peace, he famously said that the influence of modernity on international stability is inherently ambiguous.
Probably I still have a surprisingly open mind on this question, and I'm still working it out. I'm, in a sense, taking a much broader view of it than that, because I'm seeing it as one of what I'm now understanding as a pair of periods of intense transformation in human history. One that occurred at the beginnings of civilization, when people coalesced fairly rapidly into towns and cities, and then empires, and that was accompanied by a whole range of new technologies in metalworking in particular, but sailing ships, wheels, all kinds of things come around at about the same time. And you then get a remarkably stable pattern in terms of the material and social conditions that come out of that transformation, which, to my mind, go right up to the end of the 18th century. What modernity is, therefore, modernity for the time being for me is just the label that attaches to this next transformation, which is both, again, a concatenation of a lot of quite big material changes and also quite big ideational and social changes. These are still working themselves out. Are we just in a transition period from the previous era, whatever you want to call it, to modernity, if that's the label for it? Or was there some kind of rapid jump so that, by the middle of the 19th century, we were in modernity in some full sense? I'm still trying to work this out. A lot of stuff from the previous era carried on for quite a long time. So dynasticism, for example, an empire carried on for another 150 years. Racism, in the sense of a principle of human inequality, that also carried on for quite a long time. I think many would argue that patriarchy as a principle of human inequality carries on still. So there are a lot of carryovers from the earlier era. Modernity, if it exists, is not pure, but it was also an extremely rapid and dramatic change. What kind of normative consequences does this have? Well, I mean, looking at it, you can only say they go right across the board. In some senses, it has opened up all kinds of amazing areas of knowledge, and in some ways, human society has become considerably less violent and less unequal than it was. In other ways, it's an absolute nightmare. We've got far better ways of massacring ourselves, and we can commit species suicide now, where we couldn't do that before. And we might well do that. I mean, so far so good, but you know, I wouldn't put a big bet on that. Those, you know, when you ask me to choose, no, I'm nowhere ready to choose, because I haven't yet fully understood what the process is. That's what writing this book is about, is to ask those questions.
And I think the book definitely opens up scope for more work on this concept of global modernity. And although your own approach is characterized, I think, by this willingness to think big and look for the macro dynamics, in the book and elsewhere, you and George Wilson have also encouraged IR scholars to produce granular accounts of particular events and processes within global modernity. So I was wondering, if you were to produce such a granular account of global modernity yourself, which event or process would you want to focus on?
I'm mainly going to dodge this question in the sense, and the explanation comes from this, because I mentioned earlier that I've co-authored with a lot of people. And that, of course, makes me extremely vulnerable to academic nitpickers who will say, yes, but how do you maintain consistency? You know, Buzan and Little said this, and Buzan and Weber said that, and Buzan and Lawson said this, and it doesn't all add up. Well, yes, it doesn't always add up, partly because I hope I'm still growing and developing as a thinker and as an analyst, but partly because I see each of these co-authorships as a different person. Right? So there's me, Buzan, and I write some things by myself. But then if I write things with Ole Weber, then Buzan and Weber is another person, and I'm not obliged to maintain consistency between either Buzan and Weber, or Buzan and Weber and Buzan and Little. So that's the kind of background to the answer to this. So Buzan and Lawson, okay. George is the global historical sociologist guy. All right, I'm just an interloper in that world. I like that world, but I'm not trained in it, and it's not my kind of home base in many ways. So the call for detailed studies is George's call to his colleagues in global historical sociology to fill in the gaps in this story that we told, which are many. I am definitely not a detailed studies guy. I've been there and done that twice, and I never want to do it again. It's kind of fun in a way, but it doesn't play to my strength. Such comparative advantages I have is flying at a very high altitude and looking down on things from that perspective. And for some reason, I seem to be able to do that reasonably well, and I feel it's easy for me to do, whereas for many others, it's difficult. If you nonetheless force me to choose, I would probably focus on Japan. And I've done that a little bit. I've done some work on Japan with Hitomi Koyama and also with Edelin Go. And I'm fascinated by the way in which Japan is consistently marginalized in Western thinking about international relations. You can see this most clearly if you look at the literature on modernity. If you look at the statistical literature, Japan is absolutely incontrovertibly there in the first round of modernizers. It's with that group, including Italy and Spain and Russia, which were the last subgroup of the first round of modernizers, after which nothing happened until the 1970s. But when, and going back to Eurocentrism, when you read about modernity, by God, it comes across as a Western phenomenon, and the Japanese get mentioned on the edge as if they were some kind of late copier. No, the Japanese were no more copiers than the Germans and the French and the Russians and indeed the Americans. They were in that first round, along in the later part of it, but definitely in it. And it seems to me that the story of Japan and the role it played all through international relations is very much understudied and underaccounted for in the general story of IR. So I'd probably go with that, but then I'd have to learn Japanese, and I don't have that much time.
Okay, well, I hope Japan will get more light in mainstream IR in the future. And perhaps then just one more question that builds on a related topic, which is the concept of the standard of civilization, which probably has conceptual links to global modernity and is a concept whose origins lie with the English school. And you once described this as a durable concept that's worth keeping in play in IR. And a civilization like modernity seems to be a highly nebulous and loaded term, but one that has clearly historically played a key role in the emergence and maintenance of the international order. So could you say how this conceptual lens has influenced your own scholarship over the years, and how we might use this idea of the standard of civilization today to think about the present and especially future of the international order?
Yeah, partly this is just a mischievous thing on my part, because standard of civilization is clearly a phrase that will offend some people. But I like it because it's a very robust and honest phrase. What it represents was almost entirely nasty, although perhaps understandable in the context of its day. But I like the bluntness of it. It's basically saying, there's only one civilization, and we're it, and we set the standards, and you've got to follow that. So to some extent, it's about just calling a spade, right? That rather tthan using polite, evasive, liberal language like conditionality or development or all of that, you just call it the standard of civilization and get it over with. I'm not expecting anybody's going to do this. So it was just a bit of mischief and a provocation to make people aware, to the extent that I could, that while they might think that the standard of civilization was something that only worked in the past, in fact, it's very much alive and well today. And here, apologies to John in advance. I think this has a lot to do with the story of liberalism. That within liberalism, there are pretty strong assumptions about the superiority of liberal values, and that whole kind of, these are universal values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Liberalism has been very clever about presenting itself as tolerant, because in some narrow ways it is, but it is certainly not tolerant of anything that challenges its teleology that the future has to end up looking liberal. And this seems to me to be a pretty deep problem in the present international society, because liberalism is, sorry, John, liberalism is a weakening force at the moment. We are moving into a more pluralist world, a deeply pluralist world indeed, I would argue, in which liberalism will be one of the ideologies in play, but it will have lost both the moral force and the material backing that gave it such tremendous prominence and power over the last couple of centuries. And in this sense, I think we're in a transformational moment.
Right. Barry, why don't we turn to China, and maybe you can say a little bit more about this, because I take it from you that you see the rise or the return of China as more than a power transition story. It's really a story of a modernity project that is illiberal, that is a profound alternative grand experiment that needs to be seen in that way and understood in that way. Can you say a little bit more about China's modernity project and where you see it going, and in what sense is it challenging these liberal vision, these liberal ideas about convergence and kind of enlightenment, the liberal enlightenment project of building modern society around these basic building blocks of science, technology, open societies, and so forth. So how much do you see it as a profound alternative experiment, and how should IR scholars cut into that?
Right. I think first of all, on the question of power transition, there's been a lot of emphasis, I think, particularly in the American side of the business, on this power transition theory. I mean, it's an offshoot of polarity theory, which I think I debunked a little while ago, but it's nonetheless popular. I see the power transition between the US and China as being only one part, a significant part, but only one part of a much bigger power transition, which is that between the West and the rest of the world. I mean, we've all grown up, and the discipline itself has grown up in a period in which a handful of countries, literally a handful of countries, dominated the entire planet. And since we grew up in the middle of it, we just accepted that as being normal. But if you think about it, it's not at all normal that a small group of countries should dominate the planet in that way. It comes to the point of ridiculousness that a country like Britain, in the middle of the 19th century, should have been able to occupy India and beat up China with one hand tied behind its back with no difficulty at all, without even breaking sweat. Mm. That, to me, bespeaks a very, very bizarre and abnormal set of circumstances from which we are now emerging. In other words, as modernity, whatever it is, and whatever it is, it carries with it huge amounts of wealth and power. Right? So modernity, once you've got a grip on it, generates a great deal of wealth and power. And that's what it did for this handful of countries who had the field to themselves for the better part of 2 centuries. But everybody else is now catching up. China in the lead, simply because it's the biggest and also amongst the most successful. But the big story, if you like, is the end of the Western era. It's not the power transition between China and the US. China's modernity project is something I've been grappling with for a while. In some ways, it can look incredibly scary. So you could really get extremely worried about this. It seems to me that the Chinese are, well, so far they have successfully demonstrated that the liberal package of kind of a market economy and individualism and democracy, they have very successfully demonstrated for getting to be a pretty convincing length of time that you can disaggregate this package. Right? And that's a really fundamental attack on on the liberal position. So the Chinese are basically saying, we'll take the market, thank you very much, but nothing else. We're not interested in democracy. We're not particularly interested in individualism. We don't even care that much about private property. But we think that if we treat the market as the maintenance of very strong competition, then that works. Okay? And whether you like it or not, so far, that project of theirs is doing pretty well. This confronts us with the rather awesome prospect of an authoritarian or possibly even a totalitarian form of capitalism. There seems to be a general agreement amongst those who look at China's economy that it is indeed a capitalist economy, albeit one with a lot of state intervention, but still enough to count as a capitalist economy, and therefore has the power of that and the productivity and the innovation of that. And it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping is trying to rein this back in to some extent because the Communist Party is one of the more paranoid institutions in the universe and does not want to share power with anybody. So they are confronting that classical liberal argument that if you let capitalism go, capitalism is kind of virus, it will automatically produce individualism and democracy because it disseminates power within the society. Xi Jinping is trying to find a new balance on that. And given the particular characteristics of Chinese society, it might work there. I am certainly not discounting the possibility that it would work there. That gets you into some quite complicated other scenarios which don't only affect China, but the rest of us as well, which is that one of the strengths of the liberal position was always that a command economy couldn't work because, as was demonstrated on various occasions and nowhere more graphically than in the Soviet Union, a command economy simply cannot make all of the decisions and process all of the information necessary to run something as complicated as a modern economy, and therefore it becomes spectacularly inefficient. One begins to see at this stage in history just the hint of the idea that the rapid developments in artificial intelligence may provide a solution to this problem. That which Soviet-style bureaucracies and such like could not cope with, possibly a very powerful set of AIs with fueled by vast amounts of big data. This is beginning to open up new possibilities for some kind of command economy. And this is something that affects not just China, but the rest of us as well, because the current concentration on that small number of companies that have very large amounts of information and information processing capacity and their ability to know things and control things and manipulate things, that's a worry everywhere. If you run that into what I was saying earlier about the project of the Chinese Communist Party and apparently Xi Jinping in particular, you can work out the interesting combinations for yourself on that. So yes, I think China is something different. It's something tremendously challenging to the extent that it has lifted hundreds of millions of people from poverty into middle-class status and has provided a modern economy in an astonishingly short period of time. Whatever else you might think about all of its shortcomings, those are still heroic achievements. So you have to both take your hat off to the Communist Party and damn it at the same time. It's a very mixed bag from a Western perspective. But what seems to be pretty clear is that it's not going away.
Yes. Absolutely. I guess we should sort of be bringing this to a close, and we're so thankful for you to spend time today with us to cover so much territory. I guess the last question really is, since younger IR scholars are listening in, what do you think the emerging generation of international relations scholars, those who are in graduate school now, who are just entering the field, what should they be tackling, given everything you've said? What are some important areas that you would encourage younger scholars to focus on, either empirically or theoretically? Where do you think that generation should focus? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. I mean, if it was me and I was back being a young generation and knowing what I know, then I would want to have more time to do what I'm doing now. So I would want to be looking at this global international relations project and how to think about the structure of global society and the way it's evolved. So if people were asking me what I would do, that's what I would do. If people ask me what they should do, I have only one answer to that, and it's the answer I gave throughout my teaching career, is that young scholars should do whatever interests them, right? Because you only get this one chance to shape your life around what interests you. And you should take that and make it work for you in whatever way you can. If nothing interests you, if you don't have an idea, then you shouldn't be in the academic business. Right? You're not heading in the right direction. But if you do have some kind of real clear thing that you want to know more about, then go for that, even if it looks like it's going to condemn you to a life of obscurity. You know, it might, but it might well not. I remember back when I was a PhD student at the LSE, there were some of our cohort there who were interested in Islamic politics. Right? This is in 1970. And we all laughed at them. How are you ever going to make a living at that? Who's interested in Islamic politics, for God's sake? There's a Cold War going on. You know, the political economy is falling apart. You know, blah, 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 blah. Well, hey, it worked out for them. Worked out for them just fine. So I wouldn't try and push people in any given direction. I would just say, find the direction you want to go in and go for it.
Well, on that note of contingency and inspiration, I think it's a great way to bring this discussion to an end. Barry Buzan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been truly a thrill to talk with you and to trace your ideas and thoughts across the decades. So thank you so much for this podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the great questions.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.